Hello and welcome to today's event, How Data Sharing Saves Lives. Integrating IT systems helps governments respond to emergencies and deliver critical citizen services. This is Ada Dahl, Senior Fellow at the Center for Digital Government. I'm excited to serve as the host for today's event and just want to say thank you for joining us. I know we're in for an informative session over the next hour. Now, a couple of brief housekeeping notes. You can use the recording for your reference or feel free to pass it along to colleagues. We will be sending this presentation via email to you within the next 48 hours. This webcast is designed to be interactive and you can participate in Q&A with us by asking questions at any time during the presentation. You should see a Q&A box on the bottom left of the presentation panel. Please send in your questions as they come up throughout your time. We will address as many of these questions as we can during our webinar today. If you would like to download a PDF of the slides for this presentation, you can do so by clicking the Webinar Resources widget at the bottom of the console. Also, during today's webinar, you will be able to connect with your peers via LinkedIn and Twitter. Please use hashtag GovTechLive to connect with your peers across the government technology platform via Twitter. At the close of the webinar, we encourage you to complete a brief survey about the presentation. We would like to hear what you think. If you are unable to stay with us for the entire webinar but would like to complete the survey as much as you are able, please click the survey widget at the bottom of the screen to launch the survey. Otherwise, it will pop up once the webinar concludes. At this time, we recommend you disable your pop-up blockers, and if you are experiencing any media player issues or have any other problems, please visit our webcast help guide by clicking on the help button at the bottom of the console. Joining me today are Dave Taylor and Bob Jeffcott. Dave Taylor is Vice President of State and Local Government Solutions for Software AG, where he serves as market strategist and subject matter expert for these government practices. He brings over 30 years of experience in Florida state government to Software AG. Prior to joining Software AG, David was the Chief Information Officer for the state of Florida and Executive Director for the Agency for Enterprise Information Technology. He was also the Chief Information Officer for the Florida Department of Children and Families and the Florida Department of Health. Bob Jeffcott is a Principal Systems Engineer. He has been with Software AG for 22 years. His focus is state and local government and has covered the state of Texas for over 10 years. He has worked with dozens of organizations to modernize and integrate their legacy systems at the federal, state, and local levels. The agenda for today is I'm going to say a few brief words about some dynamics, if you will, of data sharing that I've seen in the last 22 years or so as a CIO at both the state and the city level. And then we're going to have some opening remarks from Dave and Bob, as you see there on the screen. And then the three of us are going to get into a conversation, and we'll be looking for your questions, and we'll integrate all that together with a discussion through the remainder of the webinar today. More on that later when we get to that section. When I think about data sharing, there were really 5 things that kind of struck me as to what I saw happening within government. I think everybody has experienced, the exchange of information, the exchange of data between agencies and departments, both within government and within jurisdictions. I know as a city CIO, we had a lot of responsibilities of getting information, for instance, from our police department and also our city attorney over to the county for the judicial process. We also had to provide information to incarcerated individuals that were being held either at the county, the state, or the federal level. And so you could see the flows of information that were going between various organizations. Another dynamic was that at times people built consolidated information systems. When I was with the city of Minneapolis, we put together an enterprise land management system which combined all of the land management oriented functions, permitting, licensing in those areas, et cetera, within that one system. And so it really helped allow for the flow of business processes amongst all of those different departments. Third dynamic that I saw was that people interacted with another information system, often information systems that were in different jurisdictions, like at the state level, or in the case of a city, you might be dealing with the county. A couple of examples. In the city of Minneapolis, we managed a pawn system that pawn shops were to check goods that were coming into their shops against stolen property, and that was something that was used by numerous cities across Minnesota. Also, we used to go up to the site for the Minnesota building codes. There was a cloud site that was run by the state that we could turn around and pull that information down for a given type of structure that could then be readily available to our inspectors and when they were out inspecting that type of structure. A fourth area that I saw was that information systems were starting to talk to other information systems directly. And I think that's a more recent occurrence, but nonetheless, you're starting to see some of that interaction going on that doesn't necessarily have a human directly involved with it. And then the fifth one, and the one that I probably was the most surprised to find out about, when government started to put a lot of their information online in the open data era, what I found was a lot of employees were going out and looking at that open data, not just data within, if you will, their own government, but also they were looking at information that was being handled and stored within other jurisdictions like the state or maybe a county, city, the federal government. And so that was sort of a de facto data sharing arrangement that was going on, obviously without any maybe formal data sharing agreement in place. After all, it was open data. And so that was another dynamic that I think we've seen here in the last 8 or so years. With that being said, I think that now's the time that we need to hear from our speakers. But before we do that, what I would like to do with the audience is ask a question. And that is, if you would all answer with one of these selections, which data sharing barrier is most problematic? Is it the silo mentality of agencies? Is it legacy IT networks? Is it internal politics? Is it poorly integrated systems, or some other dynamic? If you would choose one of those, it would help our speakers understand where you guys are coming from. I'll give you a moment. Oh, let's see what people have chosen here. All right, silo mentality of agencies has it. And then legacy IT networks, and then internal politics and poorly integrated systems are kind of tied for third. All right, appreciate that insight, folks. Well, up next will be Dave Taylor. Dave, it's all yours.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all for joining us today. I know we have a mixed audience of public and private sector folks on this call, but I'd like to start by thanking everyone who works for government for their service. I know We often thank our military and our first responders for their service, but government workers generally have not been thanked for their service for a very long time. Now, I started my service with government for 31 years as a social worker, and later as a public health agency CIO and as a social services agency CIO. So I know the public health and the social services functions pretty well. Public health and social workers often enter into dangerous situations all the time, but they don't receive the respect or the benefits given to the high-risk classes. And I'll give you a couple examples. Public health workers are subject to, we were subject to anthrax exposure, nurses on HIV/AIDS needle sticks, our clinics are full of influenza for years and years. And social workers, when I worked in that area, we would go looking for delinquents in very bad neighborhoods, or we'd have to go to a house with abusive parents to possibly remove a child. So it's difficult work and very under-respected. So again, just want to take a moment there to thank you all for your government service, if that's the nature of your job. So let's go ahead and move ahead to the next slide here. Being a government CIO is difficult even in the best of times, and we're not in the best of times right now. During those good times, the rate of change is always increasing, but it's still somewhat manageable. You know, you have the data you need to keep business processes running well enough. You know, if you had more data that you could make better decisions, but you know, it's not readily available. You might know what data you could use, but for some reason you just can't get at it. But getting others to share their data is very difficult. And even during the best of times, without an executive or a legislative mandate, there's really been no imperative to fight that fight. And, you know, besides, you've got a lot to do without, you know, adding that much more work to it. But during times of disaster and crisis, things change, and they change really fast. Every business unit starts saying they need to know this, they can't get data from that. The governor wants a new application to share information or collect new data like, you know, hospital supply chain information that you never tracked before and you didn't even know existed. Your key citizen services get strained to the max, and in some cases even break under the load. But crisis is a time of opportunity for CIOs. So my advice here is you should always be prepared for the next crisis by knowing what your disaster and continuity of operations plans is and being really good at implementing those. A couple examples from my past, we were very much focused on disaster preparedness, and so one year I had my staff, they knew they were going to show up ready to go away for the weekend. They dropped their cell phones in a box and took our vehicles, and I required them to restore our entire data center of almost 1,000 servers in a clearing in the middle of a national forest. No buildings, no power, no water, no facilities. And they were able to do that. We learned a lot of lessons that served us very well in helping the Katrina response during the hurricanes. We've had things like sinkholes open up next to our data center. So you basically need to be very prepared and practiced. The other piece of advice I wanted to give you all is, in addition to being prepared on your plan, is being ready for the crisis with two things. First, have a wish list of those things you could never afford, but could if the money started flowing for some reason. So for example, during the anthrax event in Florida here, we used that funding to increase our internet security. During the 9/11 events, we were able to have direct funding to do physical security improvements on things like our data center and our important facilities. So being prepared in advance to be able to get access to that money is really, really smart. The second thing you need to know is know who has the data you need and use the crisis to help free up that data. That's really important. You're going to get a lot more cooperation when that need is paramount in front of everyone. And finally, never waste a crisis opportunity by only focusing on tactical issues. Don't be the CIO or the programmatic leader who feels they have to, because it's a crisis, they have to make every decision. You need to trust your staff, delegate as many tactical decisions as possible. So you can focus on leveraging the crisis to gain lasting support for your overall strategies and specifically for data sharing within your agency and the partner ecosystem. There's never going to be a better time for that. And that's all I have on that. I'll turn that back to Otto.
Thanks, Dave. Next up is Bob Jeffcott. Bob, all yours.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it, Otto. As you said, Bob Jeffcott. I've worked with many state, federal, and local agencies on data sharing initiatives over the year, and I have noticed a couple commonalities between the ones that are more successful and the ones that are a little bit less successful. The ones that tend to be more successful are the ones that have built a flexible integration layer, allowing data to be shared quickly and easily across multiple entities, most importantly, safely and securely. Without that security, you're going to have pushback on data sharing between agencies. The ones that are less successful tend to start out with a single point-to-point integration and then start to multiply that so that they have multiple point-to-point integrations that are more rigid and over time become that spaghetti-like infrastructure. So I think that true criteria for success is really having a single agnostic integration layer that can quickly and easily connect to a variety of data sources, applications, and entities. You used to hear of the term the enterprise service bus, but really it's grown beyond that now because there's so many factors involved with it: managed file transfer, API governance, analytics, those kinds of things. So it's grown beyond that, but I still like to think of that integration layer as kind of the internet highway system with easy entry and access points, multiple ways of getting to a destination, and supporting a variety of different transport methods. You know, that's really what you're going to need to have to succeed today. And this is important for several reasons. Let's face it, change is inevitable, and you need to be able to adapt quickly to those changing environments as things change. Technology changes. People are putting in new systems, standards change over time, new security requirements are constantly being put in. You know, you're starting to see customers and organizations move to the cloud. You're starting to see changes such as standard changes. SOAP used to be the rage. Now everyone wants REST services is available. So technology changes. Participants change. You're going to see new agencies incorporated. Legislative initiatives and mandates require new data sharing. You're starting to see higher volumes. You know, today we're incorporating hospitals and local Department of Health agencies as people reporting data. So, you know, those are a couple important changes. And the last, I think, and we're seeing it obviously today, is the information shared changes. What gets delivered to who and why it's important changes quickly these days. You know, in January, when I work with a lot of criminal justice and health and human service type agencies and organizations. You know, in January, opioid information sharing was all the rage. It was not just, you know, it was overdose information, it was arrest record information, it was getting resources for rehabilitation. Then with the COVID-19 issues, you know, in March, the big thing was hospital bed availability, respirator availability, PPEs. In May, you're probably going to see more of a requirement for contact tracing and tracking. So again, that information in just a few short months has changed quite a bit. And that integration layer allows for that change to happen and happen quickly and easily. It also, I think one of the biggest benefits of that integration layer is it allows for event-driven processing. You know, something that happens in one organization, one entity, may be very, very important to another agency, another organization, whether they realize it or not. You know, one of our states in the Northeast has a criminal justice information system that provides events such as arrests, releases from prison, entries into prison, those kinds of things. And one of the things that they were able to do was to share that information in real time with various organizations. So the one example that they like to use is that when someone is arrested for a DUI, what they do is they go out and check the state's school bus driver system to say, is that person a school bus driver? And if they are, they notify that particular K through 12 school district to say, hey, you want to yank this guy off of the route because they were arrested for a DUI. So again, that the ability to have that integration layer gives you that event-driven processing to share information to the right people at the right time in the right format. And my last key takeaway, you don't need to start big. You can start small as long as you have this integration layer in process. Sometimes the smallest amount of information can make the biggest difference. One of the services of that criminal justice system was a callable service that said, is a person in jail? A very enterprising programmer said, hey, I can, in a completely different agency, completely unrelated to criminal justice, that I can take advantage of that. And what they did was they incorporated that call into that API into their process. And that process was unemployment claims check processing. They saved over $100 million in the first 18 months for denying fraudulent unemployment claims checks. Because if you are in prison, you are not eligible for unemployment. So again, one piece of information made a huge cost savings difference to that state, and that money was better utilized elsewhere. And with that, I think I am going to turn it back over to Otto.
All right. Thanks, Bob. Thanks, Dave, for those remarks. I agree with you. I've really experienced those sorts of ideals and orientations that were necessary to get it through because, as you guys point out, it's a fair amount of effort. You can't do it all at once, and you kind of have to move a whole organization along. And governments have hundreds and hundreds of information systems that support what work they do for the world, and that's a lot of territory to cover. So good points there. Before we get into the panel discussion, or as I like to call it, the Fireside Chat, I'd like the audience to answer the following. What is the biggest benefit you expect from data sharing? Is it cost savings? Is it improved efficiency? Is it better decision making? Or is there some other benefit that you're expecting? I'll give you a moment to answer that. All right, let's see what folks chose. Better decision making by far, with improved efficiency, and third place was cost savings. All right, good, useful information for the speakers and everyone else out there. In this panel discussion, Dave, Bob, and I, we're going to be discussing some data sharing aspects in more depth, but we would really like to have the audience help direct our discussion as much as possible. So please submit your questions via the Q&A box on the bottom left of the presentation panel, and I'll start to weave those into our discussion as we go along here. All right, to kick things off, Bob, we often have agencies in talking about the legacy systems of record and those systems in and of themselves may impact the ability to share data. What, if any, techniques exist that can be deployed to allow sharing of data from those legacy systems?
Sure, and I did notice that was even one of the concerns from the first poll question, was that, you know, the inability to, or legacy systems being siloed. And, you know, the reason is many of those systems were built before APIs and integration was truly a thing. They are viewed as siloed, older technology. But the one thing that they don't, or is overlooked, I guess, is that those systems are typically highly customized for that entity's business requirements. You know, it isn't a one-size-fits-all package. It's been customized to meet that entity's needs. And also, it contains a lot of high-value data, so that it is truly, you know, a critical piece of your system. And yes, absolutely, you can integrate, and there are techniques. And typically, we look at it at 3 levels. You look at integration at the data level, and a lot of times it may be non-standard data like VCM, sequential files, but there are tools out there that can translate that into understood SQL and web service type capabilities as well. And then there's the program level, connecting to the COBOL, connecting to PL1, assembler, you know, the older legacy languages. And absolutely there is middleware that connect to that stuff seamlessly. And that gives you the power of the business logic, that customized business logic, so you can embrace that. And we all do know that because some of those systems are legacy, either the resources aren't there, they've retired. You saw that in New Jersey with the plea for COBOL programmers. And sometimes the code's just not there. I can't change it, I can't adapt it, it's just been running. So you do need that session level integration, what's been popularly known as screen scraping. So there is absolutely the ability to connect to those different legacy systems on a variety of different levels. And also, if I could make one point about that, is it's not only important to connect to those systems, it's important that you can connect that legacy system out to the world. There's a lot of wonderful resources out there that those legacy applications can take advantage of, and they're absolutely technologies, again, at the program level, at the data level, to call out from the legacy applications. One quick example, and I'll be quiet after that, was a private entity. Dole Foods was approached by 2 of their largest customers, Walmart and the largest food chain in Europe, and said, you have to participate in the blockchain so that we can track food recalls quicker than you do today, or you will no longer be a vendor supplier of our organizations. So that would have been a pretty big hit for them. But what they were able to do was to take their application, which was all legacy mainframe code, and with one small chain was able to call out to IBM's blockchain system. IBM called it the fastest implementation of blockchain that they had ever seen, satisfying the requirements of Walmart and the European provider. So they were able to take that legacy code, do data sharing to a blockchain to ensure that their business continuity would go on.
Yeah, and great, Bob. Yeah, and you know, I got a question here because I wanted to help a person. I believe you had talked to in the integration layer, and have an audience member out there that asked, could you please elaborate on the integration layer some more?
Sure, absolutely. I think one of the things that you will see with that integration layer is that it needs to have the ability to communicate to different technologies. So whether it be code at the Java.NET level, whether it be application integrations to SAP, to PeopleSoft, to the variety of COTS packages that are out there, or to the cloud. So you need to have an adapter so you don't have to code that stuff. So there is that ability to say, I would like to connect to Salesforce without, one, having to understand a lot about Salesforce, and two, without having to do a lot of coding for that. So I think that the ability to connect to different systems, and when we say connect, we are talking about not only passive connection, where I'm calling into a system, but also that ability to set up listeners, to say, when events happen in some system, I need to share that information to a variety of different sources. And with that integration layer, I think we're also talking about not only presenting it out as APIs, callable standard services, whether it be REST, whether it be GraphQL, whether it be, SOAP technologies, some of the older stuff, but also the ability to publish and subscribe information so that you can actually have standardized message queues. But again, the idea is that I push all of that information, all of those connectivities into a single integration layer so that when I need to add information or I need to add recipients, I can do that quickly and easily. One of the examples is the state of Pennsylvania. They were the ones doing initiatives with opioid crisis data sharing. So they combined information from local law enforcement for arrests with hospital information, with admissions, and with Health and Human Services and other, citizen support groups to be able to provide the right information at the right time. And the only way they were able to do that quickly and easily was because those connections were already available, and that integration layer allowed them to, without a lot of coding, without a lot of changes, dragging, dropping, pushing that information to the right place.
Yeah. Thanks, Bob. I appreciate that. I've got a question here from the audience talking more about motivation and exactly, what have we found that most motivates the development of sharing platforms, and who decides where that platform is housed, if you will. Dave, want to take a shot at that first? I know this is something
Sure.
I've dealt with over the years as well.
Yeah, I don't think there's one answer that will fit that question in all scenarios. It's really going to differ. On the first part of the question, need always motivates the development of a sharing platform. And the more urgent the need, the more likely it is that everyone will lean in, talk about the best way of doing it, gain trust on on what data to share and who gets access to it. And so really, need is motivated. Very rarely have I seen a data sharing project that came out of as a reaction to something that could have been done better had we had the right data at the right time in the hands of the people that could have done something useful with that. As far as the part of who decides where the platform is housed, the neat thing about the modern integration technology is it takes a large part of that question out of play. We have scenarios where each entity could have their own integration broker, have their own equipment, and have those essentially integration platforms talk to each other to control the in and out of that. You could use just one, however, in a trusted organization like the state CIO's office at the state level, or a county IT department at the county level, or the leader of a community partnership. So the technology is flexible enough to adapt to any sharing topology that works for your community.
And Dave, let me just add on to that. When we talk about data sharing, we talk about delivering that information. We're not talking about replicating that information. Some of the most successful data sharing initiatives I've seen across the states have the golden rule of we are not storing other people's information. That makes it a lot easier to get those agreements in place because they know that their data is sitting safely and securely in their own environment and only accessed when necessary. And the other piece with that is, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought on that. The other piece, the other, I think, key to success is that every agency would love to share other people's information, not necessarily their own. So they need to see something as a benefit by sharing that. And the example I used in Pennsylvania is one of my favorites because agencies were actually approaching the JNet organization to say, let us share our data with you because we are going to get some benefit out of it. So, and that's a rare occurrence. As you said, typically it's either legislative mandate or legislative mandate because of some event that happened.
Yeah, got another good question here, gentlemen. What kind of suggestions would you make to encourage governmental upgrades to legacy systems? Governmental executive staff seem to be unwilling to budgetarily accommodate proactive upgrades. There seems to be a lot of reactive dialogue about what could have been with data. Also, are you aware of any federal funding mechanisms available to local governments? I know in my own experience, one of the biggest things I did about legacy systems was to do what I call a traffic light assessment that turned around and judged legacy systems relative to were they up to date and meeting the needs of, if you will, the owner or the user or set of users of that system. Was it something that was in 3 years of needing an upgrade or potential replacement, or was it beyond useful life? And what you could end up doing is you create this picture that was color-coded, just like I took the idea from Public Works, because I think everybody has seen maps of the status of the health of roads around a state or a city or a county or whatever. And it was the same sort of thing. And it was an excellent mechanism whereby you could get leadership to see this as infrastructure that was creaking because potentially of its usage. Not that we don't have some tools that allow us to peer into some of that, but if the question is trying to upgrade legacy systems, then that was a vehicle. Dave, Bob, any additional thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think I can jump in. I'm sure Bob has something as well, but the question on to modernize a system is really a complex one. And if you take the perspective of a legislative staffer who's part of the budget committee and is going to fund this, or part of the county council funding mechanism, they need to really understand, why do you want to modernize this? Is it just, well, I have a car and I want a new car? Well, the answer to that, is going to be no. And it's like, well, why do you want a new car? Well, the upholstery is uncomfortable. You've got to kind of break it down into business reasons why you need to modernize the system. And then once you have the choice that we need to do, so what specifically do you need to do? Because a lot of people think that to fix certain aspects of their legacy application, to make those improvements, they got to throw the whole thing away. They can't just do some mitigation around the existing application and modernize it. So let me use an example. A lot of the older systems that we still see have green screen technology. And the younger people don't want to use that. They want a web interface. Well, you don't need to get rid of the older application just to put a new user interface. You can very easily wrap the existing business logic and core database and the core engine with a new UI. Maybe it's because it's hard for that system, or you've been told it's impossible for that older system to connect to modern systems like Salesforce or whatever. But that, again, is not true. Through integration, an older system can be made to connect to anything as easily as a modern system. So I could go on and on and on with examples, but in many cases, you don't need a new system. You simply need to bring up your older system up to date, and that involves much less risk, much shorter project times, and is more palatable but to the funder when they know they're reusing a lot of the existing systems that they've already paid for. They're still getting most of the benefit out of that cost that they've sunk into it. But for a little more money, they could make the system more resilient, more user-friendly, provide more services to citizens, blah, blah, blah. So that's my take on that modernization question.
Yeah. Any additional thoughts, Bob?
Sure. Just one quick additional thought on that. You know, the rip and replaces, you've seen, you know, the horror stories of those. I do think, as Dave said, that modernization approach, or even an incremental change. And honestly, that integration layer, you start to see that as a benefit. I know in the Health and Human Services, they're starting to advocate the separation of systems and using an integration layer to do best of breed rather than one big system. Is with an integration layer with a incremental approach to replacement, you're seeing a safer path than the big bang approach. And you're also seeing incremental wins along the way. You're seeing something that you may get new services, new capabilities in a few months rather than in a few years.
Yeah. Another good question here from folks out there. How important are metadata standards in data sharing? What kind of strategies do you recommend for data governance in emergency response?
I guess I'll take the first shot at that, and at least on the data governance level. And that is absolutely a key importance, is how can I be sure that my data is safe and secure? And the challenge with that, with the integration layer that you have on that to be able to change, is that different organizations have different security requirements, and you need to be able to meet all of that. That's why we talked very briefly about an API governance level, so that you can ensure an audit, you can ensure various security requirements are all met, so that maybe multiple different organizations and audiences accessing the same service, the same data, meet different requirements. Some may have OAuth, some may have certificate requirements, some may, because they're internal inside of a VPN, have a simple authorization access. And all of those things have to be available for the data governance when you're starting to talk about that. Metadata is a little bit more of a challenge because different organizations think of the same data in different terms. Dave, I'm going to pawn that one off on you a little bit, if we could.
Yeah, I wish I had a great answer for that one. I mean, metadata is of course, essential to the functioning of most systems. If you don't know what the data represents, how can you possibly communicate that to anybody else who would want to use that data? So it is important, at least at the higher level, to have an understanding of what the data is. Like, for example, in the healthcare environment, there's a difference between a service and an encounter, but in many cases, you can, and during an encounter with a patient, you can provide several services. But if the understanding there isn't the same and someone asks for a report or sharing data and they ask for the wrong thing, you're going to get a garbage in, garbage out kind of scenario. So while it's important, and there are standards, you should use them. But in most cases, you're going to find that metadata standards don't exist in certain lines of business. I don't know of it in emergency management, emergency response, that there are metadata standards. So that would take basically in a community that wanted to share information amongst their emergency response partners, would need to sit down and have a conversation. It's critical to build that trust and common agreement on what those key terms mean that you're going to share. So I wish I had a better answer than that. It is important, but it's not in most cases already packaged up for you, ready to go.
Yeah, one of the things that I always tried to do was, we were big on crafting the data dictionary for the organization. And we would look to times when we modernized an existing system or brought a new one in and said, look, we've got to build out the data dictionary. We've got to get the, like you were saying, the true, what is the definition? I mean, sometimes people were collecting the same information, but they defined it differently. There are challenges that all of a sudden start to be addressed because you set up a policy of saying, look, we're building, and this obviously can't happen it has to happen over time. It can't happen all at once, but we're going to build a data dictionary that we will keep up to date, that will allow anyone to understand what that data is and what it represents, and maybe who the owner is, or actually who the owner is, who is the subject matter expert or set of experts that know about that data. Because you're right, if you misinterpret what you have, then your decision making could really be impacted. Got a question here from a county saying that in their county, we have the technology for data integration, but the silos are impenetrable due to people who maintain them. What are the techniques for overcoming the people problem?
Yeah, that's almost a psychology question. One of the advantages that I had, Otto, was in my undergraduate work in my early career was in psychology. You know, I worked as a clinician for Humana Hospital for a while, working with all sorts of people, and I learned the art of working with difficult people and understanding what motivates them. So when you're going to run into a situation for data sharing, or you've got the people holding a critical resource and they're not cooperative, you have to build a relationship with them. You have to establish trust. You have to understand why they act the way they do. In many cases, you'll go into this unit and find they've been beaten up so bad for so long that their first response to anybody and anything is no. And it's purely a self-defense mechanism. And a lot of times you can go in and say, you know, I think we have a mutual need here. Maybe I can help you. What can I do to help you? And then maybe you can help me. It really is psychology. Once you start building relationships and you actually offer some value rather than approaching it from the other person has the value and I need to transfer it to me, you're going to get a lot more cooperation.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It's funny, my degree's in computer science, but I have a minor in psychology. I don't know if that's a prerequisite for a CIO position, but most definitely
I think it is.
We found that it was a long challenge for us to bring people together, you know, literally around the table, and start discussing why things are important to others to have the information that someone holds. And you know, I think when people get to understand what is of value to others, even though the owner of that information might not have ever understood or known that was that important to somebody, it starts getting people thinking about being more of, you know, the team player of someone who sees that value, and also the reverse. Because a lot of times, and again, that was another thing for the data dictionary, you start to find out who has what information. And people then can go and say, hey, I see you collect X, and I could really use that in this process, and then start that collaboration and start the discussions and down that path. It's not always easy, I agree. Let's see here. Here's one. How do you acquire, centralize, and promote intergovernmental data sharing agreements? For example, sharing of jail inmate data with the sheriff's office and ER data. That data could be useful for police or prosecutors, but they will know about the data availability unless directly told. Thanks. I think it's along some of these things. A lot of people need data sharing agreements in place, memorandums of understanding, etc. Gentlemen, thoughts on that? I know we've all been there and sort of done that or seen that done.
I think in general, I found the best way to help people understand the value of sharing of information, in this case sharing of jail inmate data and ER data, is to tell stories, right? And tell the stories that are relevant to them. As you and Bob were indicating, get the big picture out there in their mind so they really see the world from a larger scope than just their own need to control the data or have the data, make sure of the integrity of the data. So, for example, I'll give an example that's related to, I was once called in front of a legislative budget committee here in Florida to explain the cost and complexity of new system and getting data I need for it and funding improvements to it. So rather than just coming up and say, I need, I compared my need to theirs. In other words, I compared my system to the legislative budget system, and I asked the chairman questions about how important it was to him that the underlying budget data received from the state agencies was accurate, free from manipulation by outside agencies, stuff like that. And then he really quickly understood where I was coming from because I had framed my need in terms of what he would want and need and fear about his system. So the same thing would apply to these other folks. Figure out a story that would tell how things would be better if we were sharing data between the jail inmate data and the sheriff's office and the emergency rooms. What would it look like when that person showed up at intake and they had, the person doing the intake had all that health and human services data about that person? It would make their job safer and easier to be able to do. Tell that story.
And I do think if you search from the data sharing agreement level, Dave and I were talking about this earlier this morning, there are a host of them out there. I know State of Texas has a data sharing initiative, and they have a publicly available data sharing agreement. But above and beyond the legal text and that cooperation, I think that what Dave's saying is important. You have to humanize why it's important to share that data.
I think if you just show up at a place with essentially a contract in your hand saying, you've got this data, I need it, it's important, please sign here, you can expect to get some resistance. Before you, as Bob says, there's 1,000 of templates out there for creating intergovernmental data sharing agreements. That's the easy part. The hard part is getting that signature on it and getting the buy-in on it. And that takes work up front before the paperwork.
Yep. Yeah, agree. Guess somebody here just asked, how do you make sure the right people with the right skills are involved in the data sharing projects? Thoughts on that, gentlemen?
Yeah, I think that applies to pretty much anything, right? You need people with business analyst capability that really understand the problem that's the data sharing is going to improve. So that would be business representatives with some analytical ability from each of the data source and data consumption agencies, that partnership. These type of activities get to be very complex, and so you always need an adult in the room, and those are usually called project managers. So you want to have a trained, really good project manager, not just with paperwork skills, but also with the people skills to be able to shape the conversation towards success and make sure that everybody gets their say, to be able to identify concerns and elevate those into the conversation so they don't get pushed down. Those are probably the top two skills, and then of course your technical skills, people with knowledge about integration to be able to show people that there is a way to do this data exchange without providing risk to their existing systems and without them losing control over their data integrity.
And I think I would add one more person to that mix. you do need that executive sponsor. Again, the ones I've seen most successful are the ones where there's something in it for everybody, but there are times when it is a legislative mandate, you will share, but you need someone to be that person with enough authority and enough respect to say this will happen, this will succeed. I think it's just like with any project, you know. I mean, what we're talking about is the same skill set as you would see with any IT project.
Yeah, I think this is one of the biggest activities that IT organizations get involved with. I find that often not only do we bring the, if you will, technical expertise to the conversation, but a lot of times it may end up being our project managers involved in it. And so I found that educating my folks on their ability to understand this world of data, of bringing in our data analysts. I mean, you know, our database management world, that group collectively, theoretically, had touched and understood to a point all the data that a city or a state had. But you had to marry those folks with the subject matter experts who could talk to what a particular department or set of departments wanted to do with that information. And so getting those people in place and giving them the chance to succeed because they've been exposed with you know, techniques and knowledge about a given world. A lot of times we would get together within our IT shop before we ever you know, started to bring together all the appropriate parties within agencies and or departments to make a data sharing deal work. And so that's some of the things that we found we had to do. And like I said, it was something we seemed to do over and over and over again. It's an important aspect of making really, in reality, government run relative to its data. Let's see here. It looks like we can get one more question in from folks. And there's a silo question here. What are techniques for breaking down and addressing the state data silos when a state procures a new IT data system, since funding is typically allocated to individual agencies and decisions often rest with agency heads? And again, well, Dave, Bob, any last minute comments on that?
Sure.
Well, go ahead, Bob. No, go ahead, Bob.
Okay. I would say from a technical standpoint, an integration layer, especially when you're putting in a new system, is kind of critical. The ones that are most successful typically have that because you're going to have times of overlap between old and new systems. But also, if you look at what are my external facing interfaces that I have today, you're going to find they're going to be pretty excessive. I remember we were dealing with one higher education institute, and they said, you know what, we're putting in a brand new ERP that's going to take care of everything. We have like 5 or 6 integration points, that's it. We stopped counting after we got to 99 different entities they needed to communicate with. So, you know, that I think is critical to be able to say, I need to communicate not only within my silo, but to be successful with that, I need to communicate outside the silo as well. Dave?
Yeah, I can't overemphasize the thing that I would say more and more when I meet with CIOs all around the country is that you need to have a core competence within your organization in integration. I mean, going forward, and and currently, we're in a world of sharing data. We're not good at it. And most people don't have the knowledge, skills, and abilities related to that. What I consider to now be one of the most primary core business functions any organization needs to have. So that's really the first thing. I would say that if you're an agency involved in this process, you need to establish some type of center of excellence within your organization, have at least one or more people that have skills around data. I mean, a chief data officer is great, or at least somebody who is invested in understanding data. And then their counterpart in the IT department about technical integration, about what's the best way to handle a particular situation. Because integration, as Bob has explained before, it can be APIs, it can be direct connections, it can be old SOAP technology, it can be whatever technology is most appropriate for that particular sharing. So once you have that competence in that area, you're better positioned to have a conversation with the other partners involved that have the data in their silos. If they don't have the knowledge, skills, and ability integration, they're going to be very fearful. Once they understand really how safe and easy it can be with the right technology, they're going to be a lot more receptive to having conversations about sharing data. So it is an education process primarily. Self-education to establish the center of competence, but also education of those partners and helping them come to understand. It's also good to know there's various states and people, whatever, you should try to find someone in a comparable jurisdiction to yours to help make the case. If you're at the state level, a gentleman named Ed Kelly, he's the Chief Data Officer at the Texas Department of Information Resources. I've met with Ed many times. He's really, really smart at both technologies. He knows data and he knows how to share it, and he's written a lot of great policies. So I would recommend, if you're at the state level, talk to somebody like Ed and get the advice on how he has pursued those conversations at his level.
Yeah. Well, I want to be respectful of our 1 hour commitment today, so we're going to have to wrap it up here. In closing, I would just like to thank everyone for joining us for today's event and all the great questions and directing our conversation this afternoon. A big thank you goes out to my fellow speakers, Dave and Bob, and special thanks to our partners at Software AG for enabling us to bring this discussion to our audience. Thanks again, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you again soon at another government technology event. Take care and stay safe.